What is strategic foresight? How can strategic foresight help government leaders be more effective? And what is the mission of the Center for Strategic Foresight at the Government Accountability Office, GAO? I'll explore these questions and so much more with my very special guest, Stephen Sanford, Director of GAO's Center for Strategic Foresight. Steve, would you tell us more about the history and mission of GAO's Center for Strategic Foresight? What prompted its creation? And more importantly, how does it support the overall mission of GAO?
Sure. Well, foresight has been part of GAO's DNA for decades. It's not a new concept for GAO. If you go back and look at some of our previous strategic plans going back years, you'll see there's always an element of trend analysis and it's kind of situating the agency and the nation in a strategic context, a kind of a broader strategic context. That said, we felt there was a need to give even more emphasis to broaden the platform for GAO's foresight work, and creating the center was one of the steps in that direction. I've been building a foresight ecosystem at GAO for almost 10 years, and this was an important step in that direction. So back in fiscal year 2018, GAO's executive committee, under the leadership of our Comptroller General, Gene Dodaro, approved a charter for the Center for Strategic Foresight. And the goal was to enhance our ability to analyze current and projected trends and their potential impact, not only on GAO as an agency, but also more broadly on federal agencies and the type of work that we're asked by Congress to do.
So, Steve, with such an interesting mission and portfolio, would you tell us more about your duties and responsibilities as director for GAO's Center for Strategic Foresight?
So I'm actually dual-hatted at GAO. I lead both the strategic foresight programs as the center director, and I also lead GAO's strategic planning. And GAO, I think, is a bit unique in that setup where we have both the strategic foresight and the strategic planning functions fused in the same office. And as we'll probably get into a little bit more in our discussion, that's got some real advantages where we're able to infuse foresight into our planning activities. But my main focus as center director is assuring that GAO is really looking into the future, thinking about potential future opportunities, potential risks, potential new areas and new ways of doing things that will help the agency ultimately deliver on its mission more effectively. But it's a great job. I think it's one of the best jobs in government. I've really enjoyed it. I've got great support from, as I mentioned, our agency head, the Comptroller General, and also James Christian Blockwood, my managing director for strategic planning and external liaison. Been huge supporters of foresight at GAO, and that's been really terrific to have that kind of top level support.
Steve, what are the key strategic priorities for GAO's Center for Strategic Foresight? And more interestingly, how do these priorities connect with the emerging issues that were identified in GAO's strategic plan?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the broader context of the strategic plan. Every 4 years, as most federal agencies do, GAO issues a strategic plan. And as I mentioned at the top, we put a lot of effort into mapping out the strategic context of what the broader landscape looks like as we put that plan together. And so in our last strategic plan, we had 8 different macro trends we explored, everything from national security and the fiscal condition of the country to global cooperation and economics and trade, jobs and education. We looked at demographics, science and technology, how governance is evolving, and also environment and sustainability. And through that platform of trends, we were able to say, here are some of the broad drivers we see affecting the work we do and the things we can expect Congress to ask us to do over the next years that have really served to underpin the rest of the strategic plan's goals and objectives. Building off of that, we've been using the center to try to explore areas that maybe we didn't fully explore in the trends document from the strategic plan a number of years ago, or just issues that have evolved since then. For example, we talked about deep fakes and some challenges around those. We're really using the Center for Strategic Foresight to help focus GAO's attention and by extension, Congress's attention on important emerging issues. So our main priorities right now are to explore areas that we feel need more attention and that are going to shape federal programs and potentially the work GAO does in the future more substantially. And also just the way GAO does work. So for example, one of the areas that the center is going to focus on this year is demographics. There are a lot of demographic drivers changing how federal programs will be managed in the coming years, and they also have potentially big effects on the federal budget. So we see that the country has an aging population. Birth rates in general are down. That means we're going to have more people retiring with fewer workers to support them. That's going to pose significant financial challenges to the country. And there are other drivers that are happening on demographics in terms of rural and urban divides and where people are living, and as well just how our country looks and who is going to be in the current youth bubble that we see coming of different diverse groups. So there's a lot going on with demographics that I think is important to understand. Another project we're working on is how the whole notion of accountability, I mean, that's in our name at GAO. What does that look like in the future? So we're going to spend some time this year at the center also exploring changing ideas about how auditors can do their work. What does that look like in the future? How would an audit agency or accountability agency function in the future? What kinds of things does it need to think about in terms of skills, tools, and resources?
So, we talked about the mission of the Center for Strategic Foresight, your priorities, your other responsibilities at GAO, but we've never defined in all this conversation, what is strategic foresight? Could you tell us what strategic foresight is? And more interestingly, how does it differ from futuristic forecasting? And how can strategic foresight help government leaders be more effective?
Sure, that's a great question. And I think it's one of the biggest misconceptions about strategic foresight is that it tries to predict the future or tries to forecast things. Forecasting and foresight are related, but they are quite different. Forecasting is essentially working from existing data. A lot of times it's just time series data and projecting that out into the future, right? We have a certain set of assumptions, baseline data, maybe some constraints. And you get some smart statisticians or economists or actuaries, and they draw the line and they can tell you what that forecast is going to look like and maybe what some of the error bars are around it. But it's a prediction, and that's not what strategic foresight is about. Strategic foresight is really a tool to bring in when you don't know what that dotted line is going to be, or you don't have a good sense of it. So an analogy might be, forecasting. We're all familiar with weather forecasting, and we get our predictions for what the weather looks like over the next several days where we live. But a strategic foresight approach would ask those what if questions. What if we had a sustained drought? What if there were 3 weeks of sustained blizzards? It asks those kinds of questions, which lead you down very different paths. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So it's really where we don't have data, or we're asking questions where the forecasts are leaving off, that foresight comes to really shine. And I think there's a couple of ways that foresight can help leaders be more effective. The first when you go through a foresight exercise, especially with executives, one of the first things you do is you start challenging assumptions. Everybody goes into their work every day with a sort of set of baseline assumptions. And if you think about it, that's actually the complete opposite of forecasting, right? Forecasting, we're taking our baseline assumptions and we're trying to project into the future. Strategic foresight is saying, let's actually have a real tough conversation about those baseline assumptions. Are those even the right assumptions? Can we change them? Is there space to do that? And then that takes you down a very different path. And that's just a major change in mindset that I think is really essential for leaders to be more effective. The second thing foresight can do is, because it's interdisciplinary and it really values seeing how larger systems, especially complex systems, work, it emphasizes breaking down silos or breaking down barriers between organizational entities within an agency. And that's another, I think, vital aspect to strategic foresight, that it helps facilitate conversations across boundaries and find those places where maybe an issue doesn't have a clear owner, or maybe a risk has the potential to fall through a crack. And that's another way that foresight can really be important for leaders.
And you've said this, Steve, strategic foresight isn't new in the government, but can you tell us about some of the ways foresight has been used and applied in the operations of government?
Sure. I think one of the places folks might be most familiar with foresight work is the National Intelligence Council. It does its global trends work that was led for a number of years by Matthew Burrows. And I know that they're working on their next iteration of that document. And typically, you will talk to a lot of people in the defense and intelligence communities who have engaged in foresight through the years. And that makes sense, right? They're looking at long-range scenario plans. They need to think the unthinkable and go down those paths. So you'll find in a lot of the national security areas and the different components of DoD, and even now to some extent DHS, people thinking about this. But it's not limited there. There's a very active community across the federal government. My boss, James Christian Blockwood, he founded this group, the Federal Foresight Community of Interest, and a member of my team now has taken up the reins of being a co-chair there, Cheryl Griesiak. And through her leadership and the people she works with in that group, that's really helped create a community across government where folks can find allies and like-minded practitioners and discuss both the challenges and the success stories that come from practicing foresight in government. So it's definitely an active area. We're very fortunate at GAO where, with the stability of the way we're set up, so the Comptroller General, the head of our agency, has a 15-year term, and something like foresight can really blossom and grow over that 15-year term. And we've also had a series of Comptrollers General who have supported it. So foresight has been able to put down deep roots here at GAO. When you just look across other agencies and the natural rhythm of administrations changing and senior executives changing and political appointees changing, that steady state isn't always there for foresight. And so you'll notice variability across agencies, sort of as to how well it's rooted or whether it's been there for a long time. And I think that's one challenge the community has, but there are a lot of people really committed to it. And it's good to see, not only in this country, but also globally, there's a very active community in government trying to get out of the day-to-day kind of tactical decisions and think more long-term for the agencies.
Whether it's the Evidence Act or what have you, the demand for measurable outcomes has posed an enduring challenge in the public sector, but also in the private sector as well. Steve, can the effectiveness of strategic foresight be measured?
Yeah, this is a huge question actually in the community of practitioners of foresight. It's how do you measure this thing? And if you think about it, it is a big challenge. You have something at a a high level that's agency wide. And ultimately, you would want everything you're doing through a foresight and strategic planning effort to be supporting the overall goals and missions of the agency and whatever ways you've got set up to measure that. But that still doesn't always satisfy everybody when they think about this question. And it may be one where we have to rethink the metrics a bit. And considering an analogy outside of government might be helpful when contemplating this. So if we pretend that we are, we rewind a couple of decades, we're flip phone manufacturers, making the old school flip phones, we might have a really robust set of metrics that measure market penetration for these phones, and we're measuring defect rates as they come off the assembly line, and customer satisfaction, right? So we have this really robust set of metrics, and we think we're doing fine. But we have no clue with those metrics that there might be a huge strategic shift with the advent of smartphones or touchscreens that are going to render the flip phone obsolete. So how do you measure that, right? It's really hard on a kind of quarterly or annual cadence with the metrics that would really give you a good sense of, is your business running well or not, or is your agency delivering on its goals? How do you link that to these broader strategic questions? I'm not sure it can be. And it actually, I think, points to the need to have a regular and structured foresight process, especially linked up with strategic planning, where that is considered, where those sorts of things that aren't captured by your metrics can be on the table and can be thought about, those what-if scenarios. And that might be one way to think of it. Another would be to consider, what are the indicators of an effective foresight program? And this kind of builds a little bit on what I was talking about before. But you could imagine a set of indicators such as executive leadership buy-in, starting with the head of the agency. You could measure that. You can look at things like what are the touch points with the key business processes or key operational and mission-related processes across the agency as another potential metric. What's the visibility or awareness of the program? So there are some things that I think one could start to look at in terms of getting some indicators as to the success or robustness of a program. But I think, back to your original question, Michael, it's going to be tricky to assess, I think, with the kind of classic set of metrics that we use when we think about performance, to evaluate fully what foresight does, because it is at that strategic kind of what-if level.
Steve, we are conducting this discussion virtually as we remain in the midst of a pandemic. I was wondering, what can you tell us about the cross-sectoral impact of COVID-19 beyond the obvious health and economic aspects?
So one of the things I did with my team and the Center for Strategic Foresight at the end of March, beginning of April, in the throes of the first lockdown, was to do some work asking that question and exploring what some of the implications are, and delivering that as a product to our internal management teams. Everyone was running fire drills in terms of just how do we work remotely? How do we meet the needs of Congress? Even the mundane things of, we have travel planned, how do we cancel it? Things like that. So everyone was in fire drill mode. We thought it was an important moment in our foresight shop to take a strategic pause and think about what are some of the spillover effects of COVID in those areas, as you said, that extended beyond health and the unemployment issues. And some of those insights fell into some broad categories. For example, just questions around global security and national security. What does this mean moving forward? How destabilizing will this be as we navigate through? And I should start by saying also, Michael, that what really underscores all of this is just the massive amount of uncertainty involved, right? We are in a point right now where there seems to be easing. If you look at the numbers in terms of infection, there's a lot of questions as to, will that trend line continue? Are we going to see a second wave? A lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty, I think, informs all of these areas. So there's great uncertainty on how this will play out over the next 6 months, over the next 12 months, over the next 18 months in countries around the world. We've seen extremely differential impacts in countries. And in some countries, it's hard to get information. That's potentially destabilizing, and I think is something for us to be aware of. The second was, back in April and late March, it was apparent there were some disparities in how COVID was affecting different communities in the U.S. There's going to be a very big debate that plays out over the next year and beyond on where are we going with global integration. We were sort of at the peak in some ways of global integration before COVID hit. I mean, people were traveling all over the world in unprecedented numbers. Global trade was robust. There are going to be countries, or going to be governments that start to question their supply chains, that are going to question what are the national security implications of reliance on imports. There are going to be a lot of discussions like that had. And some of the things that we may have taken for granted in terms of global supply chains and which have actually reduced the cost of a lot of goods in recent decades. Some of those may be on the table for consideration, and not only in this country, but in others. Well, I'll end with two other points. One is, and this is near and dear to GAO's heart, just what are the impacts going to be on government finances? There was extraordinary measures taken to respond with financial support to the COVID crisis. How that plays out, states and localities are experiencing severe decreases in their tax base from the shutdowns and so forth. There's going to be a serious budgetary challenge confronting a lot of state and local governments in the coming year and beyond. That's going to have profound implications on services that are provided at that level of government, and also raise additional questions about how the federal government interacts with state and local governments. And then finally, I think we also saw through the crisis how a lot of organizations innovated very quickly in terms of either bringing different types of technology online, finding ways to work remotely when they hadn't been able to do that before. I think there's a big question as to whether that innovation mindset will continue post-COVID or is just a flash in the pan. And I think that's a question a lot of agencies and organizations are wrestling with in terms of what this COVID year has meant in terms of long-term impact on agencies and organizations.
So, Steve, in 2019, the Center for Strategic Foresight at GAO convened a conference to discuss policy challenges related to two issues: deepfakes and the evolving trends in space. Would you tell us more about these emerging issues? What are deepfakes? And what insights came out of that conference?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. We were really excited about that conference. It was a chance to really, as one of the inaugural public events that the center was doing, explore two issues that we had been tracking in the center and also with my foresight team for a while. One of them around deepfakes, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then also a lot of really neat things happening in space. And 2019 saw the advent of 3 different countries trying to land vehicles on the moon. None of them were Russia or the U.S. So that the whole landscape of who's doing what in space had changed. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the governance structures that apply to space, right? Who owns something on the moon? What happens when private actors start doing stuff on the moon? Some of the treaty regimes we have in place, we heard from experts, never contemplated the idea that you could have private sector actors doing stuff in space to the extent they are. And this was a fascinating area to explore. We're also, we're far more reliant on satellites than ever before. And space is big and vast, but it's also in some ways getting crowded. I've got a member of my team right now working on some research into space debris, which was one of the things that came out of that conference. This idea that there's a huge risk from everything from crewed space exploration and operations to just getting stuff into orbit or even out of orbit for deeper space exploration, of running into other objects. There's a lot of space junk in orbit that could be catastrophic if something is hit. And it's a cascading effect. This is the other interesting thing that came out of the conversation. If you have one or two disasters in terms of colliding stuff in space, you're creating more and more debris, which is going to create more and more risk of further such collisions. So there's a kind of major opportunity that's happening right now in space, and we've seen that with the public-private sector collaborations that took place this year with getting crewed launch. But there's also a number of things that need to be worked out. So that was a first step in exploring some of those space issues. Deep fakes was also an issue we were tracking quite closely. Artificial intelligence, coming back to artificial intelligence, that technology has evolved in a way where there are many algorithms that can generate things that only previously humans could generate, right? Whether that's text or human voice, whether that's an image or a video. AI algorithms and systems are able to synthesize these things, and that creates the potential for what happens when fake media is injected into platforms that we all use every day in our lives. So social media's influence and prevalence in people's lives is nothing new. And to the extent that misinformation campaigns or deepfakes might be used in those platforms is a big consideration, something that's been of interest to Congress. We briefed a couple of committees on the Hill after that work. And then we also partnered with the science and technology team we mentioned and talked about earlier. They issued a technology spotlight on deepfakes as well. So that spun out of our conference. So it's really about highlighting issues that either maybe aren't getting as much attention as they should from a broader audience, such as the space policy issues that we explored, or highlighting and casting extra attention onto things that have the potential to be disruptive, like deep fakes. But it's interesting. Deep fakes is getting to the point where we see a kind of cat and mouse game evolving, where algorithms are getting good at creating it, but then forensic algorithms are getting good at detecting it. And so there's this almost arms race of which is going to be better. And a lot of what we talked about in the conference too was around the need for education. This idea of digital literacy and for users of social media platforms to understand that these risks exist, and that there can also be industry solutions to help address some of this, such as watermarking and things like that are being explored.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Steve Sanford, Director of GAO's Center for Strategic Foresight. Subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.